and how we come to an experience of archetype, particularly the animal archetype, within the perception of life. I'm going to start by bringing an image of Shylock from A Merchant of Venice onto the stage. There he is, stage center. And I'm going to remind you what his big mistake was. Shylock's colossal blunder. He forgot the blood. He forgot that if you cut someone, they will bleed. Strangely, he was very much aware that if he was cut, he would bleed. But in demanding his pound of flesh from Antonio, he did not take into account that Antonio would bleed. So the court ruled, when he was put on trial, the court ruled that yes, he was welcome to take his pound of flesh, but if he spilt a drop of blood, that would be him, that would be trouble. Now, Shylock's predicament, in fact, is a fantastic metaphor for what has happened in scientific thinking and how that has been applied to biology, to living processes. Shylock was able to perceive his own life processes. He knew that if someone cut him, he would bleed. But he was blinded to those of the other, to those of Antonio, from whom he demanded a pound of flesh. Shylock bargained with substance and forgot the life. And that's why this is a metaphor for what has gone on in biology in the last quite a few years. Shylock's relationship to Antonio was, in the words of Martin Buber, an I-it relationship. It was a relationship of objectification, not a dynamic I-thou relationship, in which what happens is one distinguishes the other as separate, but also instantaneously relates that other to oneself through the act of perception. Now, let me just clarify that, because that's an important part of this whole theme. When we perceive something outside of ourselves, our cognitive process is always in a dynamic state of both distinguishing it and relating it back to the self. We always unite with the other in thought. Whatever we may think of them, we may hate them, but we are still united with them in thought. However, the important thing also is, where do we place our focus? Do we place it on the one-sided side of distinguishing, of analysis, of categorization, the I-it relationship? Or do we make a further step in and consciously perceive the other in thinking activity as intrinsically relating back to us? So distinguishing and relating is the I-thou relationship. And it's good to realize that this thought dynamic, this cognitive movement between these two poles of I and thou, mimics the processes of life. Because life is a dynamic movement. In its crudest sense, a dynamic movement between birth and death. Life is not the opposite of death. It's a dynamic movement between birth and death. So in order to think about life, this is the way to do it. We have to think in a way that reflects the processes of life. We need to think in the way that reflects the processes of the thing we want to study. So, dynamic thinking for dynamic processes. living thinking for living processes. Now, interesting things have happened in the mainstream of biology in recent years, in the last 40 years, I would say, with a realization, perhaps not very surprising to us, but a realization that living processes are orders of magnitude different from non-living. James Lovelock contributed to this picture by pointing out that life on this planet was not just a passenger on a dead rock, but was in a deep, intense, intimate, integrated, moving relationship with this earth. He stated quite clearly that life enlivens the rock, the earth on which we live. He said that. And this was a major saltation, a major jump in the perception of living processes by the mainstream. Life revealed itself as radically different from inorganic processes. It reveals itself as a self-regulating, cybernetic process, far more complex than anything inorganic. Nature itself was shouting itself at us. But, as so often happens, appropriate concepts, appropriate mobile concepts were not available to match the implications of what nature was revealing within science. So what happened was that science resorted back to the old ways of analysis and calculation, and rather than developing new ways of perceiving and building new concepts, what happened was that all the analysis and calculations proved rather complex, and all modeling, all hypothesis testing, all research on life was relegated to machines. And the reason for that is that our brains are thought not to be able to deal with the complexity of life. Now, the problem with machines is that they have their advantages and their uses, but they're not able to think dynamically. They are not able to think in a living way, so they only return to us what they know. And that is calculated abstractions. They return to us crude, impoverished abstractions of life. Now, those of you who know me know that I work in evolutionary biology. And even in that field, in my own research field, we have relegated everything to machines. And they give quite interesting, quite precise results, but they are all crude, impoverished abstractions of life. The machines will never, ever help us encounter the archetypes. And actually, that is the aim of my research, to explore that question. But machines are going to be no help to me. I am in the process of researching an encounter with animal archetypes. I want to convince myself, and if possible, to convince others, that these archetypes exist and are perceptible in reality, and not just within my cognitive process. Even though in my cognitive process is where I perceive them. If I am to work with these archetypes in a real way, it is also very important for me to be convinced that they are not just impositions of my mind. And if archetypes have an existence of their own, then anyone should be able to perceive them. And I think that if we engage our thinking process in the right way, in a way that mimics life, then I think anyone can perceive them. Now, what that means is tuning the cognitive process, tuning the thinking process into perceiving things as relationships, I-thou. Remember the I-thou relationship, and not as separate, isolated objects. When we can do this properly, when we can enter into seeing around us in terms of relationships, of dynamic relationships, then the cognitive process becomes our observation tool. Once we have our observation tool, we can apply it to our research questions, just like in the mainstream, just like in the conventional manner. And my research question, my personal research question, my personal thing that keeps me awake at night is, what is the meaning behind the dynamic changes in animal forms through time? And that is the meaning of morphological dynamics, the changes in form through time. Now, these changes can be seen at different levels. Firstly, these changes can be seen at the level of form movements during growth. And these are the easiest for us to understand because these changes are perceptible more or less in our lifetimes, at least in some cases. So we can really enter into those quite nicely. Secondly, there are the phylogenetic. These are the form changes and movements during evolutionary time. And these are less easily understood because the time spans are very, very much greater, much longer than our lifetimes. But we do have the advantage of stratigraphy, and we do have the advantages of fossils, which show us that these changes take place. And finally, there's my favorite because it's so weird. There's what I call extreme transmutations. Now, these are changes from one radically different type to another. For example, the kind of change that took place in Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, when a human being woke up one day to find he'd been turned into an insect. Now, these extreme transmutations, I don't know whether they really happen in reality. Nevertheless, I need to note them because I can think them, and Franz Kafka could think them too. I can meditate such transformations in my mind, so immediately there has to be the question, what degree of reality do they hold? Or are they impositions from my mind? What I've found is whatever reality they do or do not hold, oops, excuse me, I'll just go back. Whatever reality there is in these extreme transmutations, it is a very revealing exercise to do. It teaches one a great deal about one thing with relationship to another. But whether they actually take place on some real level, I do not know. When I meditate them, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what they are. I don't know where they take place. So I shall not actually mention extreme transmutations anymore today. They are an intensive field of research for me, I can tell you that much. Let's stay with the slightly easier ones of the ontogenetic and the phylogenetic. Now, some of the basic exercises in Goethean science, which many of you will know, involve the ontogenetic observations. That means intense and exact observations of something followed by meditative exercises. And everybody's favorite is the leaf series. You can meditate on the leaf patterns of plants, or, impressively, the spinal columns of animals. This is the Carnegie Diplodocus, I believe, in Berlin. And you can make these meditative transformations. What you do is you transform the elements, each leaf in this case, each vertebra in this case, into the others. And that focuses the mind activity on distinguishing and relating. So by making these meditative transformations, you are actually starting to think in the way that reflects life. And these meditative exercises bring about a perception of archetypal movements. In this case, the archetypal movement called leaf. In this case, the archetypal movement called vertebra. And you can demonstrate that the archetypal movements in the perception of relationships is not an imposition of the mind. Here you can actually have an objective quality control, because if you separate out the leaves and present them to somebody who's never seen a leaf series like that before, they will still nevertheless intuit relationships between the leaves and intuit them correctly. So what you can have there is a proof, in a way, that these relationships are real. The perception of the leaves is done with the senses, but the perception of relationships is not. It is supersensible. The perception of relationships is done with this dynamic thought process that I'm talking about. And this is important. This is the first step to clairvoyance, to realize how we perceive something that is not perceptible to the five senses. The components are perceptible to the five senses, the relationships are not. And from this perception of relationships comes the idea of leaf and the idea of vertebra. And we can also then start intuiting other leaves which are not there, and other vertebrae which are not there. And in doing so, we reach a perception of archetypal movement called leaf, archetypal movement called vertebra. Now I shall just quickly show you what it is I do exactly, because I'm concerned with the evolutionary dynamic side of this. And what I do is I apply the same methodology, but I apply it to the fossil record of an animal. For example, here we see the elephant. And I study the fossils, the fossil record of elephants as much as I can. And then I take that into meditation, and I meditate on the transformations within that record. And this activity can lead to a real experience of the quality of elephant. And I think that by doing these meditative exercises, we achieve a resonance with the archetype of elephant. But here the objectivity is different. This can only be achieved in group work, because the quality control for a cognitive process is other people. If other people meditate the same system, the same thing, and come to similar experiences of the quality of elephant, then I have my objectivity. So to summarize, I study the extensive expression of elephants, meaning the possible types of elephants, and the very quality of elephant which I derive from meditative exercises derived from exact observation of what there is. And what there is the intensive expression of the archetype. During meditation, and this is a very important part of the Goethean process, as you all know, during the meditation you step out of the everyday perceptions of time, which are in fact particulate and divided, and you enter into the flow of time. And these animal archetypes live within that flow of time. That's how you experience them. But you can only really experience them in the meditative process. And the qualities of the archetype reveal themselves there. Now, because I've only got a few more minutes, one more minute possibly, I'm just going to very quickly say that there is an application to this method for farming and for animal breeding. You see, what you can do, If you grasp the archetype and the way that it reveals itself with animals, you can understand what you are doing precisely when you are breeding your animals. So, for example, if you're breeding cattle without horns or sheep that produce masses of wool, you need to ask, am I allowing adequate expression of the archetype, or am I constraining the form or physiology of the animal far too much, such that the archetype can't express, and thereby the life processes can't express properly? And that could lead to sick animals. And similarly, in farming, you can perhaps constrain the environment of the animal in another way by feeding it improperly or housing it improperly. These are physical constraints which do affect the expression of the archetype and of the life processes. So that is the application of my research for farming. I think that's my excuse for being here.